Hello, welcome to Module 4. In this module, we are going to talk about the impacts of the African Continental Free Trade Area. In terms of the learning objectives, we'll talk about the welfare gains and losses arising from the FTA. We'll identify the vulnerable groups and discuss the policies that can be used to mitigate losses. We'll assess the likely effects of the continental free trade area on industrialization prospects in Africa, with a focus on small and medium enterprises. And we'll try to understand how the AfCFTA would affect Africa's women. Let us start with some theoretical considerations. When it comes to the framework that we use to assess welfare effects of FTAs, the framework we typically use is one developed by Jacob Viner in 1950. He talks in terms of the trade creation and trade diversion effects of FTAs. Trade creation occurs because in an FTA tariffs are reduced, and as tariffs are reduced, that spurs trade. So resources are allocated in a better way, more efficiently, and lower tariffs results in lower prices, which benefit customers eventually. So that increases consumer surplus, which is a measure of consumer welfare. Hence, trade creation effect on the whole is positive. Trade diversion occurs because when tariffs are reduced, that may lead to the diversion of imports from a country outside of the FTA to a country which is now a member of the FTA, but which may not be the lowest cost supplier. So this country may have an advantage over an otherwise more efficient supplier because it benefits from a tariff preference, from a preference margin. So trade diversion leads to a loss of consumer welfare and is welfare reducing. So on the whole, the net welfare effect depends on the sum of the trade creation and the trade diversion effects. In addition to these static effects, there are also dynamic effects arising from, for example, economies of scale, the fact that inputs are now cheaper, and that could lead to lower prices, and that could lead to more enhanced competition as well. Obviously, these effects are going to benefit intra-Africa trade. As a result of countries implementing the AfCFTA commitments, there will be a boost to trade liberalization. Lower tariffs could lead to welfare effects. Especially since intra-Africa trade is known to be intensive in manufacturers, the implementation of the AfCFTA agreement can be a boon for industrialization in Africa. In other words, it can spur industrial development in Africa. And there could be wider benefits as a result of enhanced cooperation, innovation, and technology transfer. When it comes to estimating the impacts of FTAs, we tend to use a combination of, there are different kinds of models. Most of the AfCFTA impacts that we are going to look at in this presentation are based on simulations using computable general equilibrium models. These are huge models. They may vary in structure and assumptions they make. There are thousands of parameters that are at play, and actually that is one reason why these models also come under attack, because some people might say that these models are so big, they make so many assumptions that changing any one of those assumptions can lead to different, sometimes very different results. So these studies differ along many dimensions. For example, they differ in terms of whether complementary policies are implemented. Complementary policies can be different kinds of policies other than tariff liberalization. So it can be reduction of non-tariff barriers. It could be trade costs generally. It could be other kinds of complementary policies. The second is whether domestic income distribution effects are considered. Some models consider them, some models don't, and also whether the models allow for dynamic effects. So dynamic effects would be dynamic as opposed to the static. A static model would be a one-shot model, like for example, if there is trade liberalization, what would be the impact now? Whereas dynamic effects would be effects over time. So dynamic models allow for longer term effects to play out. Most of the models tend to focus on goods exclusively, and there's a reason for that. Tariff liberalization obviously are more or easier to model than other kinds of trade liberalization. For example, liberalization of services. Many models. So let us review some selected studies. So this is we are going to look at 4 studies. These are recent studies. There are obviously many more, but I have chosen to focus on these 4. And these studies give us some estimated impacts of the African continental free trade area. Let us start with this study by Mervel and Karingi, 2 economists at the UNECA. It's a study going back to 2013. They look at the impact of the FTA with full tariff liberalization supplemented by trade facilitation. They find that intra-Africa trade would increase by about 52% by 2022. This year is a sort of a reference year, obviously, given the delay with the implementation of the agreement. This year would move a bit further. And much of the increase in intra-Africa trade is due to the expansion of industrial exports. The gains are widespread, so both skilled and unskilled workers in agriculture as well as non-agricultural sectors would gain. Trade facilitation, if implemented alongside tariff liberalization, actually would maximize the impact of the CFTA. The next study is by Chauvin and Associates. That's a 2016 study. They look at the cumulative impact of trade liberalization in 6 African countries, and they consider 4 incremental scenarios. So incremental means that they start with tariff liberalization on agricultural goods, and then they add to that tariff liberalization on manufactured goods. On that, they add a 50% reduction in non-tariff barriers, and finally, they add a 30% reduction in transaction costs. They find that welfare would increase by about 2.6% by the year 2027, and with the biggest reduction in NTBs and transaction costs contributing most to welfare gains. So the point is that tariff liberalization in itself doesn't bring much in terms of welfare gains. Okay? Most of the impact is from reduction in non-tariff barriers and implementation of trade facilitation measures. The next study is another ECA study, this one a bit more recent, that is 2018. They look at the impact of trade liberalization under various scenarios, and they find that GDP would increase by about 1%. So that is small, which is consistent with most other studies, 1 to 2%. And exports would increase by 3%. Intra-Africa trade is estimated to increase by up to 25% by the year 2040. Well, the study further finds that small economies would actually gain most, while the loss of tariff revenue would be modest. In most cases, it would be less than 10%. And the most recent study I could find is a study by a group of IMF economists. That's a 2019 study. They look at the welfare effects of full tariff liberalization and a partial reduction in NTBs under the AfCFTA agreement on 45 African countries. The study, like some of the other studies that we looked at, do not explicitly consider services trade liberalization. They find that welfare gains from tariff liberalization alone would be very small, less than 1%, in fact, very close to 0%. The gain defined is 0.05%, so even less than 1%, even less than 0.1%. However, a 35% reduction in non-tariff barriers causes welfare to increase by 1.7%, with the effect increasing non-linearly with the magnitude of reduction in NTB. So again, this goes to show that the biggest impact would come not from tariff liberalization as such, but from reduction in non-tariff barriers and implementation of trade facilitation measures or measures that generally would reduce transaction costs. All countries gain from trade liberalization, even though not equally. In 20 countries, the welfare gain exceeds the median for Africa. So this goes to suggest that the gains would be widespread. All countries gain, and in some countries, the gains would be quite significant. Let us focus on the impact on Africa's industrialization. Why this is worth looking at? Well, let us recall that manufactured goods make up 36% of intra-Africa exports compared to 24% of African exports to the rest of the world. So the point is that intra-Africa trade is more intensive in manufactured goods than is Africa's trade with the rest of the world. So obviously, implementation of the continental free trade area would give a boost to industrialization. So it can actually stimulate the development of small and medium enterprises in the manufacturing sector, further increasing the share of manufactured exports. The AfCFTA agreement also includes several provisions that support the African Union's Accelerated Industrial Development of Africa initiative, the AIDA initiative. The Protocol on Trade and Services can also help boost intra-Africa services trade as well as merchandise exports by enhancing competitiveness of inputs and services. And obviously, you have other protocols like the Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, which can help catalyze opportunities through better flows of skills and capital in the region. And then the forthcoming protocols on investment, competition, on intellectual property rights, on e-commerce can provide added stimulus to industrial development. So a whole set of protocols and agreements existing as well as forthcoming, which could further enhance industrialization prospects in Africa. And the simulation studies confirm that the AfCFTA has important potential impacts on industrial output in Africa. For example, the ECA study that we looked at finds that intra-Africa trade would increase, and that this increase would be most pronounced in industrial sectors. And this study, the IMF study, finds that over 60% of the increase in income under the AfCFTA will actually come from higher manufacturing output compared to only 16% from the agricultural sector. So again, these are all positive signs which confirm that implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area would actually give a boost to industrialization on the continent. Now, obviously, when on the one side there will be gains from implementation of the AfCFTA, but there will also be losses. On the whole, we saw that there will be gains, but it doesn't mean that everybody gains. I mean, this is the nature of trade liberalization. This is how it is. There will always be losers and gainers. But the point we are making here is that the gains offset the loss on the whole, so that on average there are net gains. However, there will be vulnerable groups, there will be groups that stand to lose, and these groups obviously need to be supported if they are to benefit from implementation of the CFTA. So, so even though on aggregate there will be welfare gains, some groups may incur adjustment costs as resources are reallocated across sectors. The simplest example would be trade liberalization would actually cause import competing industries to shrink, whereas the export sector will expand. So obviously that leads to a reallocation of resources, and people who are working in import competing industries, they might lose jobs, whereas people would be finding jobs in the export sector. So adjustment costs and a redistribution of gains. But on the whole, these adjustment costs are likely to be small for various reasons. First, as we have noted, intra-Africa trade is generally a small proportion of a country's trade, something that, in fact, implementation of the AfCFTA is meant to change. And much of the intra-Africa trade takes place through regional economic communities, FTAs, where tariffs already are low, which means that potential gains from further tariff liberalization are likely to be small, and so also would be the costs flowing from further tariff cuts, because tariffs already are low. And the last point is that the AfCFTA provides for exclusion lists and safeguards, which have the effect of protecting certain sectors and therefore minimizing the loss that these sectors sustain. So you have exclusion lists that allow members to omit specific sectors from trade liberalization commitments, or allow them longer periods to implement such commitments. And then you have safeguards that allow member states to raise tariffs temporarily to protect themselves from import surges. Obviously, the impact of adjustment costs can be minimized by using complementary policies, flanking policies. These are measures such as subsidies, trade facilitation, and other incentives to compensate losers from trade liberalization. We can readily identify 4 vulnerable groups, meaning groups that, if they are not protected, they may actually lose from implementation of the AfCFTA. These are smallholder farmers, cross-border traders, women, and youth. When it comes to women or more African women tend to be concentrated in low-value subsistence agriculture rather than cash crops for exports, and they also tend to be involved in informal cross-border trade, and so these are sectors that may not directly benefit from the implementation of the continental free trade area. So obviously, women will be at a loss if they are not protected through complementary measures. And that brings us to the end of Module 4. Thank you.